The Unconquerable One was known across the galaxy as the strongest being to ever exist. His name was whispered with fear and respect by those who had heard of his incredible strength. His feats were legendary, and many had tried to challenge him, only to fail in the most humiliating ways. Every time someone thought they could defeat him, he crushed them without breaking a sweat. The Unconquerable One was an unstoppable force, and no one had ever come close to matching his power. His muscles were massive, his speed unmatched, and his strength was beyond measure. He had fought countless battles across different planets, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. No one could touch him, and his reputation grew with every victory. There were stories of entire armies falling to his might, of whole civilizations surrendering at the mere thought of facing him. He was a god of war, and his power seemed infinite. But one day, something unexpected happened. The Unconquerable One, who had never known defeat, received a strange message. It came from a human, a species he had always thought of as weak and insignificant. The message was brief, yet it carried a challenge. "I can beat you." The words seemed almost comical. How could a mere human even think about facing someone like him? The Unconquerable One laughed as he read the message, tossing it aside. Who was this human to challenge him? No human had ever posed a real threat to him before. But as the day passed, something about the message stuck in his mind. Why would this human send such a message? What made them think they could defeat him? There was no logic to it. The Unconquerable One had never been one to ignore a challenge, no matter how absurd it seemed. So he decided to find out. He sent a response, telling the human to come to him if they were brave enough. The human didn't back down. A meeting was set, and the Unconquerable One prepared to face this strange challenger. The day arrived, and the Unconquerable One stood waiting. He stood tall, his enormous frame casting a shadow over the battlefield. He had fought countless opponents before, but none had ever given him the slightest bit of concern. This time, however, things felt different. He could sense that something unusual was coming, though he couldn't understand why. He pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the coming duel. His enemies had always underestimated him, and they had always paid the price. This human would be no different. As the Unconquerable One waited, he couldn't help but notice how quiet the world around him was. The wind had stopped, the birds were silent, and even the distant sounds of creatures in the forest seemed to hold their breath. It was as though the universe itself was waiting for something. He stood there, his arms crossed, tapping his foot impatiently, but even he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in his chest. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a soft noise in the distance. The Unconquerable One turned his head, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. In the distance, he saw a small figure walking toward him. It was the human. The Unconquerable One squinted, trying to make out the figure. It was hard to believe that this tiny, fragile-looking creature was the one who had sent the challenge. The human was small, barely reaching the Unconquerable One's waist. The only thing remarkable about them was the way they walked. There was no hesitation, no fear in their steps. They moved with a strange confidence, as if they were completely sure of what was going to happen. The Unconquerable One chuckled to himself. He had faced creatures twice his size, beings made of pure energy, and warriors with weapons capable of destroying planets. And now, here was a human, a weakling, walking toward him with no armor, no weapons, no hope. This was going to be easy. As the human drew closer, the Unconquerable One studied them carefully. The human wore simple clothes, nothing fancy or threatening. They had a calm expression on their face, their eyes locked with his, filled with an unwavering focus. It was strange, the Unconquerable One thought. Most of his opponents would have trembled in fear by now, but not this one. This human wasn't scared. If anything, they looked almost disappointed. It was a look he had never seen before. For a moment, the Unconquerable One felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, something like doubt. "Are you the one who challenged me?" The unconquerable one asked, his voice booming across the quiet field. His tone was filled with amusement, as if the question itself was a joke. "You're the one who thinks they can defeat me." The human didn't flinch. Instead, they nodded slowly, as if they had been expecting this question all along. "Yes," they said simply. Their voice was steady, calm, and there was no sign of fear. "I can defeat you." The unconquerable one laughed. It was a deep, booming sound, one that echoed through the air. "You defeat me," he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "How? With your tiny hands? Your weak body?" The human's gaze never wavered. "Strength is not about size," they replied. "It's about will. It's about heart. You may be strong, but you've never faced someone with the will to win like I have." The unconquerable one's smile faded slightly, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of something unsettling in his chest. This human wasn't just speaking to him like an opponent. They were speaking as if they truly believed they could win. And that belief, that unwavering confidence, made the unconquerable one uneasy. He shook off the feeling. There was no way a human could defeat him. No matter how strong their will was, it would be nothing against his power. "Let's see if your will can save you," he said, cracking his knuckles and preparing for the battle that would prove his dominance once and for all. The human didn't move. They just stood there, their eyes locked onto his, waiting for the battle to begin. And so, the stage was set. The unconquerable one, the most powerful being in the universe, was about to face a human in a duel that would determine not only their fate, but perhaps the very definition of what true strength really was. The unconquerable one smiled to himself, thinking about how easy this would be. But deep down, a small voice, one he couldn't quite ignore, whispered that maybe, just maybe, this human wasn't as weak as he thought. The unconquerable one stood in front of the human, towering over them. The human looked so small compared to him, almost like a child standing before a giant. But there was no fear in their eyes, only calm determination. The unconquerable one couldn't understand it. How could this weakling even consider challenging him? Still, he couldn't ignore the strange feeling that had begun to creep into his mind. The human's confidence was unsettling, and for the first time in a long time, he wondered if he might be facing more than just a typical opponent. Without saying a word, the unconquerable one lunged forward, moving faster than any normal being could. His fist rocketed toward the human, a blow strong enough to shatter mountains. But the human didn't flinch. They didn't even move. At the last possible moment, the human shifted their weight just enough to the side, dodging the attack by a hair's breadth. The unconquerable one's fist hit the ground with a thunderous crash, sending dirt and rocks flying in all directions. He stood there, his hand still embedded in the earth, his eyes wide with surprise. He hadn't expected the human to move so quickly. He had expected them to panic, to try to run, or to freeze in fear. But instead, they had simply avoided the blow as if it was nothing. The unconquerable one pulled his fist from the ground, his mind racing. How had they done that? His speed was unmatched. No one had ever dodged him before, not in all his battles. Could this human truly be faster than he was? He narrowed his eyes, watching carefully as the human stood their ground, waiting for his next move. Without warning, the human took a step forward. It was slow, deliberate. The unconquerable one's eyes widened in confusion. Why wasn't the human attacking? Shouldn't they be trying to land a hit while he was recovering from his missed strike? But instead of charging him, the human simply stood there, their gaze unwavering. "What are you waiting for?" the unconquerable one demanded. His voice was sharp, filled with disbelief. "You think you can beat me by doing nothing." The human smiled, but there was no arrogance in the smile, no mockery. It was calm. It was knowing. "I'm not waiting," the human replied. "I'm watching." The unconquerable one felt a strange chill run down his spine. Watching? What could they possibly be watching? They hadn't even tried to land a punch. They hadn't tried to do anything. This was madness. The humans should have been scrambling to escape, but instead, they were standing there, observing him like he was the one who was weak. It made no sense. Furious, the unconquerable one charged again. This time, he moved even faster, his movements like lightning. His powerful legs propelled him forward in a blur. He aimed for the human's chest, intending to crush them with a single blow. But again, the human did something strange. Instead of dodging, they dropped to the ground, sliding out of the way so effortlessly, it was as if they had anticipated the move. The unconquerable one's fist struck the air, missing the human by inches. He staggered forward, barely managing to stop himself before he fell. His heart was pounding now, not from the physical exertion, but from something deeper, a feeling of being off balance. He was used to overwhelming his enemies with speed and power, but the human was different. They weren't just avoiding his attacks. They were studying him, learning from each move, and the unconquerable one didn't like it. He spun around, swinging his massive arm to catch the human in a powerful backhand. The human had no choice but to dodge, but this time, they didn't just avoid the attack. They seemed to predict it. They ducked and rolled, moving with a fluidity that seemed impossible for someone so small. The unconquerable one's fist passed mere inches above their head, and for the first time in the battle, he felt his grip on the situation slipping. "What are you?" The unconquerable one growled, frustration creeping into his voice. "How are you doing this?" The human rose to their feet, brushing dirt from their clothes. They didn't answer immediately. They simply took a deep breath and steadied themselves, eyes locked onto the unconquerable one. It was as though they were absorbing everything, studying his every move. And then, they spoke, their voice calm and steady. "You're strong," the human said, "but strength alone isn't enough. You rely too much on your power. You don't think. You don't plan." The words hit the unconquerable one like a slap to the face. No one had ever spoken to him like that. No one had ever dared to criticize him. He had always been the one who did the talking, the one who made others fear him. But this human, this tiny creature, was doing the unthinkable. They were challenging his way of thinking, questioning everything he believed in. The unconquerable one gritted his teeth, his anger growing. He couldn't understand it. He was the strongest, the most powerful being in the universe. And yet this human, this fragile creature, was somehow making him doubt himself. It was infuriating. "I don't need to plan," he spat. "I don't need to think. I am the unconquerable one. No one can beat me." But even as he said the words, a tiny seed of doubt took root in his mind. He had never been tested like this before. Every opponent he had faced had crumbled under his might. But the human wasn't crumbling. The human wasn't running. And they weren't afraid. They were standing tall, waiting for him to make his next move. And they were watching, always watching. The unconquerable one didn't have time to dwell on these thoughts. With a roar, he charged again, his massive fists aimed directly at the human. He wouldn't stop until they were crushed under his power. But the human was ready. Once again, they dodged his attacks, moving with an unnatural grace. Each time he struck, the human was already one step ahead. They weren't just avoiding him. They were making him chase them, forcing him to move faster and faster, pushing him beyond his limits. As the battle wore on, the unconquerable one began to feel something he had never felt before: exhaustion. His muscles burned, his movements slowed, and the human was still there, still evading him, still watching him with those calm, knowing eyes. It was maddening. The unconquerable one stopped for a moment, panting heavily, his mind racing. What was going wrong? Why wasn't he winning? Why wasn't this human terrified of him? They should have been. They should have been on their knees, begging for mercy. But instead, they were the ones who seemed in control. And that thought, the thought that he wasn't in control, was the most terrifying thing of all. The battle had been going on for what felt like hours, though neither combatant had slowed down. The unconquerable one's frustration was growing with each passing moment. His punches, each one capable of obliterating planets, were being avoided with the grace and precision of someone who had been trained in the art of war for years. Yet the human wasn't using any known fighting style. They were just dodging and watching. With every move the unconquerable one made, the human was there, one step ahead, always anticipating. It didn't make sense. He had fought against warlords, titans, and monsters that could bend the very laws of physics. He had crushed them all. But this human, this tiny creature, was different. They weren't just evading him, they were making him work harder than he had ever worked in his life. For the first time in his life, the unconquerable one felt the burn of exhaustion creeping into his muscles. His breath came in short, sharp bursts, and sweat trickled down his face. His legs, so strong and fast moments ago, now felt heavy. His hands, usually so steady and precise, now shook with frustration. It was as though the human was wearing him down with their sheer willpower. "Why won't you just give up?" the unconquerable one growled, his voice trained with anger. He was starting to lose his patience. He had never needed to ask that question before. His enemies had always given up or been defeated before it even got to this point. The human didn't answer right away. They simply stood there, breathing calmly, not a single drop of sweat on their face. It was as if they weren't even tired, as if they had all the time in the world. They gave a slight shrug, as if to say that the answer was obvious. "Because I'm not fighting you with strength," the human said. Their voice was still calm, still unwavering. "I'm fighting you with something far stronger." The unconquerable one's anger flared. "What could possibly be stronger than my strength?" he demanded, his voice a growl. "I am the strongest in the universe. No one can defeat me." The human smiled, but it wasn't a mocking smile. It wasn't one of arrogance. It was the smile of someone who had come to understand something the unconquerable one had never considered. "You're right," the human said, taking a step forward. "You are the strongest in the universe. But that strength doesn't make you unbeatable." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the unconquerable one couldn't speak. He was stunned. The human's words were cutting through his mind like a blade, opening up a crack in his perception of reality. He had always believed that strength alone was enough to conquer anything. But now, standing face to face with the human, he was starting to wonder if he was wrong. The human continued, their tone soft but firm. "Strength is only one part of the equation. It's about heart, willpower, the determination to keep going when everything says you should stop. And that's something you don't understand." The unconquerable one took a step back, his heart racing. The human's words echoed in his mind. Was that true? Had he been so consumed by his own power that he had forgotten the true meaning of strength? Was he just a brute, relying solely on his muscles and the fear he inspired in others? The human continued, pressing their point. "You've never faced someone who doesn't fear you. You've never faced someone who doesn't back down. And that's why you're losing." The unconquerable one's mind was swirling with confusion. He had always believed that he was the ultimate being, that no one could ever challenge him. But now, the human's words were making him question everything he had known. Had he been wrong all this time? The human didn't give him a chance to answer. Instead, they stepped forward again, this time faster than before. The unconquerable one instinctively swung his fist toward them, but the human was already gone, slipping past him with ease. They were getting faster, more unpredictable, and the unconquerable one was beginning to feel like he was chasing shadows. The human didn't stop. They moved in and out of his range, making him chase them, tire himself out. Every time he thought he had them cornered, they were already gone, slipping through his grasp like smoke. He could hear their voice in his mind, taunting him, reminding him that his strength alone wouldn't win this battle. "You think you can beat me with your power?" the human called over their shoulder, as they darted away once more. But that's the problem. You've been relying on it your whole life, and now you don't know how to win any other way. With every passing moment, the unconquerable one could feel the weight of their words. He was starting to doubt himself, starting to realize that he might not be as invincible as he had always believed. He was stronger than anyone else, but that strength was becoming a weakness. He couldn't keep up. He couldn't anticipate the human's moves. And worst of all, the human was wearing him down, not with power, but with something far more dangerous: patience. The unconquerable one stopped for a moment, his breath ragged and his chest heaving. The human was standing in front of him now, their arms crossed, looking at him as though they had already won. "Are you done yet?" the human asked. There was no smugness in their voice, no sense of victory. It was simply a statement. The unconquerable one felt something in his chest tighten. The word struck him like a blow. He was done, not because he had lost the fight, but because he had never thought this was how it would end. He had always believed that strength would be enough to overcome anything, anyone. But now, standing before this human, he realized how wrong he had been. The unconquerable one's gaze flickered to the ground. He had always been the one to dictate the terms of battle, to set the pace. But this time, it was the human who was in control. They were making him question everything he had ever known about strength. He clenched his fists, trying to push through the exhaustion, the frustration, and the doubt. But deep down, he knew that the human had already won, not through strength, but through something far more powerful, something the unconquerable one had never understood: the will to fight when everything seemed impossible. And for the first time in his life, the unconquerable one was starting to realize that this human wasn't just challenging him for the title of strongest in the universe. They were challenging everything he thought he knew about what true strength really was. The unconquerable one stood there, panting, his body exhausted from the relentless battle. He had fought countless beings, powerful creatures who had tested him in ways he had never expected. But this human was different. They had not fought him with strength or power. They had fought him with patience, with endurance, with something he couldn't quite grasp. It was maddening. The humans stood in front of him, not mocking him, not boasting about their superiority. They simply waited, their gaze calm and steady. It was as though they had already won, and now they were just waiting for him to realize it. For the first time in his life, the unconquerable one wasn't sure what to do. He had always been the one who set the pace. He was the one who determined the outcome of the battle. But now, for the first time, he was the one being led. He was the one who was uncertain. He had never felt this before. He had always been the predator, never the prey. "You think you've won, don't you?" The unconquerable one finally spoke, his voice low and heavy with frustration. It was the first time he had truly admitted to himself that he might not be in control anymore. The human didn't answer immediately. They simply took a step forward, closing the distance between them. The unconquerable one's heart raced. What were they doing? Were they trying to provoke him? He couldn't tell, but there was something about the way they moved, something about their stillness, that made him feel both anger and fear. The human reached out a hand, but instead of attacking, they placed it on his shoulder. The gesture was simple, yet it carried an unexpected weight. The unconquerable one flinched at the touch, not from pain, but from the vulnerability it triggered. He had never allowed anyone to get this close to him, physically or emotionally. "You haven't lost," the human said quietly, their voice steady. "But you're not winning either. You're stuck, fighting yourself." The words sank into him like stones, and for a brief moment, the unconquerable one was silent. He had never thought of it that way. He had been fighting with all of his might, pouring all his strength into every blow, but what had he really accomplished? He was exhausted, he was frustrated, and he hadn't landed a single hit. "I don't understand," the unconquerable one admitted, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. "I've never lost like this. I've never had to think." I just fight. The human smiled, but it wasn't a smile of mockery. It was a smile of understanding. That's your problem. You've spent your whole life fighting because it's all you know. You've never had to stop and think about why you're fighting. You've never had to fight for something greater than just winning. The unconquerable one's mind was spinning. What was this human saying? What could they possibly know about fighting? About strength? They were nothing compared to him. And yet, here they were, standing calmly before him, forcing him to rethink everything he had ever known. You're right about one thing, the human continued. You are the strongest in the universe. But strength isn't about how much power you have. It's about how you use it. And you've been using your strength to dominate, to crush anything in your path, without ever stopping to think about the consequences. The unconquerable one's chest tightened. It was true. All he had ever known was dominance, the belief that if he was strong enough, nothing else mattered. He had crushed opponents, destroyed armies, and earned his title as the most powerful being in existence. But now, as he stood before this human, he couldn't help but wonder if he had been wrong all along. You may have defeated countless beings, but you've never defeated yourself, the human said, their voice quiet but firm. You've never had to confront your own limits, your own weaknesses. That's what makes you vulnerable. The words hit him harder than any punch could. He had always thought of himself as invincible, untouchable. But now, standing before this human, he was forced to see that his strength had never been the true measure of his power. His strength had only made him blind to the things that truly mattered. For a moment, the unconquerable one was speechless. The human had broken through his defenses, not with force, but with words. They had made him realize something he had never considered before, that true strength wasn't about overpowering others, but about understanding and controlling oneself. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the human's words pressing down on him. There was no more anger, no more frustration. All that remained was a quiet, dawning realization. He had spent his entire existence believing that power alone was enough. But now, he knew the truth. Power without purpose, without self-awareness, was meaningless. The human stepped back, giving him space to think. The unconquerable one was silent for a long moment, lost in thought. He could feel the weight of his own arrogance, the weight of his belief that nothing could ever challenge him. But now, that arrogance seemed hollow. He had always been the one in control, but now, he was the one who needed to learn to grow. I understand, the unconquerable one said slowly, his voice quieter than it had ever been. I've been fighting the wrong battle. The human nodded, their expression calm. You're not fighting me, they said. You're fighting yourself. And that's a battle only you can win. For the first time in his life, the unconquerable one felt something he had never felt before, humility. He had always believed that strength was all that mattered, but now, he saw that true strength came from within. It came from the ability to understand oneself, to know one's own limitations, and to grow beyond them. The human's words had broken through the walls he had built around himself. The unconquerable one had always prided himself on his power, but now he realized that true power came from something much deeper, something that didn't rely on brute force. It came from the will to change, the courage to face one's own weaknesses, and the strength to overcome them. The battle wasn't over yet, but the unconquerable one knew that he had already lost something far more important than a fight. He had lost his belief in his own invincibility, and that, he realized, was the first step toward true victory. The unconquerable one stood in silence, the weight of his own thoughts pressing down on him like an avalanche. The human had shown him something he had never seen before, something beyond strength and power. It wasn't something he could defeat with a single punch. It was something far more profound. It was humility. For the first time, he looked at the human not as an enemy to be crushed, but as someone who had unlocked a truth he had spent his entire existence avoiding. The battle had shifted from a contest of strength to a deeper, more personal journey. It was no longer about winning or losing. It was about understanding himself and confronting the limits he had always refused to acknowledge. The humans stood a few paces away, their posture still calm and steady, as if the whole universe wasn't hanging in the balance. They weren't gloating, nor were they offering pity. They simply waited for him to act, waited for him to make the next move, which would be his to make and no one else's. "I have nothing left to prove," the unconquerable one muttered, his voice almost a whisper. The words were foreign to him. He had spent his entire life proving himself, proving that he was the strongest. He had crushed enemies, dominated worlds, and instilled fear in all who dared challenge him. But now, standing before this human, he felt no desire to prove anything at all. The human nodded, as though they had known this would happen. "Then stop fighting yourself." It was a simple statement, but it carried an immense weight. The unconquerable one had been at war with himself for so long, fighting to maintain the belief that his strength made him untouchable. But in truth, his strength had been his greatest weakness. It had kept him from seeing the truth that no one, not even the strongest, could live without facing their own flaws and limitations. For the first time, the unconquerable one felt the tension in his body start to ease. The anger that had once burned so brightly within him began to fade. The desire to prove himself to the universe, to crush all who opposed him, seemed distant, almost childish. What was the point? What had he really gained from all of it? The human stepped forward, their movements slow and deliberate, like a teacher guiding their student. "You are powerful," they said softly. "You are strong. But power without purpose is nothing. And purpose comes from within. It comes from understanding that strength doesn't make you invincible. It's your heart that does." The unconquerable one felt his heart beat stronger as the human's words resonated within him. He had always believed that power was everything, that it defined his worth. But now, as he stood here with this human, he saw that true strength came from something much deeper. It came from humility, from purpose, from the ability to change when faced with the truth. I understand now," the unconquerable one said, his voice trembling slightly. "I've been blinded by my own power." The human smiled, but it wasn't a smile of victory. It wasn't a smile of conquest. It was simply a smile of understanding. "We all have our battles to fight," they said, "but the greatest battle is the one we fight within ourselves." The unconquerable one nodded, feeling a deep shift inside him. He wasn't the same being who had entered this battle. He wasn't the same warrior who had believed that strength alone could conquer all. He had learned a new truth, that true strength wasn't just about overwhelming others. It was about understanding, growing, and evolving. It was about fighting for something greater than yourself. The human turned and began to walk away, their footsteps steady and calm. The unconquerable one watched them, unsure of what to do next. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to chase them, not with anger, not with the desire to defeat them. Instead, he stood still, his heart heavy with the weight of his new understanding. The human paused for a moment, glancing back at him. Their gaze was steady, but there was no malice, no challenge, just an acknowledgement of the journey they had both been on. "You'll figure it out," the human said simply. "We all do, eventually." And with that, they turned and walked into the distance, disappearing into the horizon. The unconquerable one stood alone, the dust settling around him. He no longer felt the need to prove himself to anyone. He didn't need to be the strongest, the most powerful. What mattered now was finding his own path, his own purpose. The battle was over, but his true journey was just beginning. He had always believed that strength was the measure of everything, but now he understood that the true measure of a being was something far more profound. Strength, when used blindly, could destroy. But strength, when guided by wisdom and humility, could transform the world. The unconquerable one looked up at the sky, a new understanding in his eyes. He wasn't invincible. He wasn't untouchable. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that he had the power to change, to grow, and to become something more than he had ever been before. And as he stood there, in the quiet aftermath of the battle, he knew that this was the beginning of something much greater than anything he had ever achieved with his strength alone.